I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm thrilled to be speaking with Luke Fernandez and Susan J. Matt, both from Weber State University. Their newest book, Bored, Lonely, Angry, Stupid, Changing Feelings About Technology from the Telegraph to Twitter, explores a number of ideas that demonstrate our contemporary situation in which we're using perhaps social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, what have you, and are feeling certain ways may very well be products of the technologies that we're using and the societies that we're in, as opposed to universal human truths. And it's a really fascinating book. I look forward to sharing this interview with you. First, I just want to say, make sure you check out tinapp.org, where you can see their book recommendations and listen to other interviews and catch up on whatever episodes you might have missed in the last few weeks or months. Definitely, I appreciate when people can repost or retweet and support the podcast in various ways. So please be sure you do that if you're enjoying what you're listening to. Susan, Luke, thank you so much for joining me today. Maybe we can start with each of you introducing yourselves and people can hear what you sound like. And maybe you can say who you are, of course, but also how you came to start writing this book together.
Yeah, typically I tell the origin story. I'm Luke Fernandez. I work the School of Computing here at Weber State University.
I'm Susan Matt, a history professor, and I study the history of emotions.
Chris, you asked us maybe about the origin story of the book. Mm-hmm. It was about Susan's a historian, so she knows the chronology a little more precisely than I do. But about 10 years ago, like many other academics, we were imagining, or at least perceiving, or at least imagining that our students were not listening to us when we were lecturing in the classroom, and that they were distracted, not because of the quality of our own teaching, for goodness sake. It was because of their cell phones that they were bringing into the classroom. And so we were wondering, well, what could we do about this? Short of improving our own teaching, maybe what we could do is, at the time I was working in IT mostly, although I was doing some adjunct teaching. And I posted on a listserv for chief information officers, what could we do about this? And one guy suggested, well, what if you made your classrooms into Faraday cages? And the Faraday cage, this thing that sort of blocks electromagnetic radiation. So when students come into the classroom with their phones, they just would be forced to listen to us. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a pretty good idea. But, of course, it was pretty much a fantasy. As too was our idea, well, if we couldn't implement Faraday cages, maybe we could put some cabins around campus and invite students to, retire there during maybe finals. So they'd be off the grid and be able to focus more, better on their work. But those were all fantasies. We couldn't really implement those things. But we did realize, this does seem like to be an interesting concern. A lot of people are interested in this. Some books were being written at the time about this, like Nicholas Carr, mm-hmm. The Shallows, is the internet, is Google making us stupid? That was an article he wrote in Atlantic. And we taught a course that was funded by the NEH, or we proposed to teach a course ourselves, Are Machines Making Us Stupid? And that was a very rewarding class, and we learned a lot from our students. And one of the things we realized was a lot of this stuff seems kind of obvious in retrospect, but I don't think it was at the time, that these anxieties that we were having about attention and distraction in the classroom were just one of many types of anxieties that we were actually experiencing with regard to other sort of mental states.
There was a whole literature in the popular press that addressed kind of parallel questions. There was the classic Stephen Marche article in 2012, is Facebook making us lonely? And then there was a spate of articles on, how is narcissism changing in the age of the selfie and Facebook? Are we becoming bored or incapable of experiencing boredom? What's happening to our anger? So all of these questions seem to abound in the popular press, but they only seem to think about maybe the last decade. And there was a kind of implied contrast that since 1990 or since 2000, have we become more narcissistic or not? Or they were very limited in the historical periods they'd examine. And so Luke was telling me all about this discourse. As a historian of the emotions, I was thinking, well, some of these feelings didn't even exist 150 years ago. And we came to think that together we could explore how our emotions have changed over time in response to new technologies, not just in the last 10 years or 20 years, but over the last couple centuries, because human feelings don't hold steady across time, nor do our technologies. And so what we were interested was seeing how our personalities have changed over this longer period, and what role has technology had in that change.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to put it succinctly in a word that using a word that we would probably avoid with other kind of audiences, we noticed that these anxieties were very much occurring now, but that it would seem like it would be a good idea to historicize them and show their how they had historical precedence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely one of the key strengths of the book, is to look back beyond a decade or so and to really, I guess, try to unpack what it is that we're talking about, and to realize that a lot of these things that we think are new are not necessarily new, although they're appearing in new ways, perhaps. Feel free to choose your favorite or the most interesting, but maybe you could say a little bit about how, for example, loneliness seemed to be sort of good thing, or at least a way of pleasing God in some ways for early Americans. And then it became something that was to be almost dreaded and to be a curse that we needed to fix. And so, yeah, how have some of the emotions and the ways that we've thought about ourselves and our communities changed when we take a 100 or 200 year perspective?
Yeah, that's interesting. You start with loneliness. It actually was the first chapter that we wrote, even though it's not the first chapter in the book.
And we were intrigued about whether we were getting lonelier. There were a number of articles that have come out in the last decade that talked about a loneliness epidemic, that began to say that loneliness could be bad for your heart, for your cancer risk. Mm-hmm. We're not discounting that being alone when you don't want to be is a bad and unpleasant thing. So, but we were aware that the way we're thinking about loneliness today is not the way earlier generations of Americans had thought of it, and that in many ways, while they didn't love loneliness at all moments of their lives, they were far less worried about it and far differently worried about it than we are. So, for instance, the word lonely, loneliness, lonesome, they only enter the English language about 1600. And some argue that they come along as the rise of Protestantism is happening, as capitalism is happening, as individualism is developing. So these are kind of new feeling states. That's not to say people hadn't grappled with the problem of being alone before on their own, but they didn't have a word for it. Yet even in those early centuries of the 1600s, 1700s, and the 19th century, when they do use the word, it's got a different valence than it does today. So we found people in colonial America and the early republic talking about how they were going to be on their own and they weren't necessarily thrilled by the idea. But on the other hand, they thought perhaps God had willed it, that this was their destiny. Many thought that loneliness was an inevitable part of the human condition. Maybe God was making you alone to teach you lessons. Maybe being alone would give you revelation. Maybe it would deepen your soul. And they often called being alone not loneliness so much as solitude.
You know, I think it's epitomized or captured very well. This sort of the story of loneliness is captured very well in a Google Ngram. Not everyone knows what a Google Ngram is, but you can look it up easily on the web, and it's a corpus of texts that Google searches through that go all the way back to the early 19th century. And if you type in a word like loneliness or solitude, it'll return the frequency of use across time. And if you graph both loneliness and solitude, and show the sort of their frequency along one axis being time and the other one being frequency, you'll see if the y-axis of frequency of use, you'll see that the word loneliness increases while the word solitude decreases. What might that suggest about the story of loneliness? Well, we know that those words have very different sort of connotations and describe the state of being alone very differently. One has positive connotations. Solitude sort of celebrates the state of being alone, whereas loneliness does not. And since loneliness is the word that we use more often, I mean, the graph suggests that we regard aloneness with more sort of negatively than we did in the past. And that's really, I think, a powerful illustration of how our culture, if not our technologies, sort of reshape these feelings that we think of as sort of biological and welling from just sort of inside of us naturally are reconstructed by the language we use to describe them.
I'm glad you mentioned the engrams. I mean, that's a really great illustration of the changes over a longer period of time. You also have vanity and narcissism, where vanity has decreased quite a bit and narcissism has increased more recently. How do you start to, I guess, unpack these things? Because I'm just thinking, like, in my own experience, I know what vanity is. It's the mirror that you might get in a sort of antique shop or something, at least in my head. And I know that narcissism has been around forever and that people are getting more and more narcissistic. But of course, that's my limited time span. Looking back over hundreds of years, we realize that, narcissism has its own history, and not everyone was taking selfies, obviously. But you could look at portraiture, which you do. And basically, once you get outside of your own personal time frame where you kind of understand the culture, how do you start to understand things like vanity, narcissism, lonesomeness, or solitude? How did you do that, and what practices or methodologies helped you understand these things once you go significantly further back than your own experience?
Part of it is just immersing ourselves in the 18th century and 19th century texts and finding out the vocabularies as well as the value system attached to those vocabularies. And some of it's also doing a lot of etymology and looking at, say, the Oxford English Dictionary. So when does vanity come into existence as a concept? When does narcissism, start getting bandied about? We pay a lot of attention to the words. We don't think it's only words that are shaping our feelings, but certainly the terms we use have such a significant effect on how we conceive of what we're feeling and how we understand what we're feeling. So really, we try to understand the terms of our own era, but really, dive deep into the earlier generations' vocabularies and moral universes to get to the words they were using. And what seemed to us one deficiency of the current conversation was that there was this kind of built-in assumption that, well, the word narcissism has always been used. Mm-hmm. And that's just not the case. I mean, it really gets coined in 1898 and Freud writes on it in 1914. Before that, that's not the main way people are thinking about whether they're too self-absorbed or too self-involved. Admittedly, the myth of Narcissus exists much longer than that, but it's not an ism yet. The key way people thought about self-absorption was using the concepts of vanity and, on occasion, egotism.
Or pride as well. And compared to a word like narcissism, which has sort of more clinical framing of the behavior, pride and vanity have much stronger connotations of religion or sort of moral judgment attached to them. So what was formerly described with words that were used by moralists increasingly was being described with a language that psychologists or clinicians would use.
And I'm also curious then how you think about it. I mean, in my own work, I've dealt with the word homosexuality, which has a similar clinical history. And so you go back to 1700, nobody was talking about homosexuality as a word. And it can become an interesting sort of philosophical question that I often pose to students is, did homosexuals exist? Because literally they didn't exist because nobody said those words. But of course, if you want to talk about what we're probably referring to when you say homosexual, then yes, indeed, they existed earlier than that. How do you think about narcissism and other terms that didn't really appear? Do you consider them existing prior to that? Or do you have to, mentally make some changes in the way that you approach these ideas that they revolve around?
No, that's a really good, and that's a great question. I mean, it's pertinent in all our chapters, but perhaps most manifest on our chapter on boredom, in which we, explore that emotion. But it's a word that really only emerges when, Susan? Exactly.
In the 1850s. So
right. So you can, depending on who you talk to, say, well, boredom just really didn't exist prior to then. I think Susan, who is a bit more committed to the history of the emotions than I do, resists the idea that boredom exists prior to the invention of the word. And I go, well, wait a sec. People have the feeling of idleness, of ennui, of what was the old ancient term?
Acedia.
Acedia. I mean, isn't that boredom? And I guess your response was partly that's anachronistic thinking. You're trying to sort of read the past through our present framework, and that's just not. It gets you part of the way there, but it also obfuscates as much as it clarifies how people experience the past.
And, within the history of emotions, obviously, there's this growing school of thought that our book is part of, that, feelings change over time. There's a parallel movement in psychology, and there are lots of different theories that play into it, but one is the theory of constructed emotion. One of the more prominent proponents of it is a woman named Lisa Feldman Barrett, who wrote How Emotions Are Made. And she and her colleagues argue that basically human beings all have a range of, or let's say all have pleasant and unpleasant sensations that vary in degree. But how we categorize those, what we call them, which sensations we pay attention to, and which ones don't really come into our vision of our feelings, varies across cultures and across generations. And so while we may have some shared neurological wiring across time and place, what parts of those we focus on and how we name them differs profoundly. And in focusing on them and naming them, we kind of reinforce what we're feeling. So if I'm feeling uncomfortable and I suddenly think, well, I'm sad, then I know how I'm supposed to act, right? And that heightens the feeling. And so I do think it matters that boredom doesn't exist before the 1850s. Bored and boring, by the way, come into being in the late 18th century, but boredom as a state inside of yourself doesn't exist. And I think that matters. Tasks could be monotonous, days could be dull, you could be idle, but the inner state of understimulation just wasn't recognized as a problem until then.
People recognized drudgery, but they never had the word boredom to describe it. And, this also comes into play with, it doesn't just pertain to this work. Susan has written prior to this book on boredom, on her current book, had written a book on homesickness. And she was very accustomed to talk to audiences about how in the 19th century, people actually died of homesickness. That was a malady that was a formal diagnosis. And I always resist that. Well, that's how they talked about it, but they didn't actually die of it. And you never sort of resist that. You just take it at prima facie value that that's how they framed it back then. And so that's how it was. And to try to sort of reinterpret how doctors made their diagnoses back then is sort of being kind of presentist.
Well, I think it assumes that we have the final set of categories, right? That our categories today are the ones that are the telos of history, right? And that we've figured it out. And these are the 7 emotions that exist. And these are the ones that hurt you this way or help you that way. And of course, our categories are going to fall by the wayside in 10 or 20 years. And we'll claim they didn't exist, and they'll revise the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, once again. And things that were pathologies will no longer be, and things that aren't will become so.
Like what, FOMO and JOMO.
Yeah.
I'm just waiting for those to appear in
the DSM.
Right, right.
Yeah. Well, do you have any advice then, or maybe experience that you want to share about how to approach these things? Because, again, from my experience, going back to homosexuality, that was in the DSM as a mental disorder. Obviously, it's been taken out. Narcissistic personality disorder has been included, which it wasn't, I believe, in the originals, although correct me if I'm wrong. But so things are clearly changing, and in some cases, very, very significant ways. So we kind of know that we're wrong. We kind of know that the DSM-5 will be significantly altered to the point where maybe 100 years from now, people will look at us as if we were crazy ourselves. How do you work within that environment when you're trying to, talk about emotions, talk about mental disorders, perhaps? What advice do you have? What strategies do you use?
Well, I think some psychologists probably resent our resistance to their categories as universal statements or diagnoses, and maybe that's a productive tension. I do think there is a growing field within neuroscience that's, sort of cultural neuroscience, and is beginning to recognize the role that society is playing. So I'm hoping that eventually a larger portion of the psychologists who have kind of staked their ground and claimed this is their terrain to tell us, what's a pathology, what's not, what's a good feeling, what's not. I'm hoping a larger and larger portion will come to acknowledge psychology as a historical artifact in itself that's always changing. And I just have always thought that the possibility that human nature could be protean, which is, coming from romantic theories of the self. I like that formulation very much, that there's not one set human nature, but many, many different combinations and possibilities. And I find my students sometimes resist that. They want, when I teach a history of emotions class, they want to see their own selves as kind of the norm for all of human history. And that's, I think, part of a good education is seeing yourself as only part of the story, right? And not the end of history.
Yeah, and I think in terms of working with our press, in terms of how to pitch the book to an audience and make it relevant, I mean, I think we try, perhaps we didn't do it as successfully as we'd like in the book itself, which is a bit of a tome, but we do try as much as possible to say, hey, there are some self-help aspects in our volume. You can read it a bit like Jenny Odell's book,
How to Do Nothing?
How to Do Nothing. But the kind of self-help that we have to offer is, that you can, if you're trying to find a better mental state, work on your own emotions, part of doing that is perhaps not just reading the DSM or Psychology Today, but also reading the history of emotions, because it can help to contextualize your feelings. And you can maybe work out a little better about where these sentiments or these feelings are arising from. Are they just being produced internally, or are they in part also a result of social and cultural, and then, as we try to emphasize, historical forces, that a lot of what we're feeling is constructed not just by, society right now here today, but by the fact that we live in America and that our ancestors believed this way, looked at the world this way, and that technology and culture have reshaped things so that we have these particular, set of dispositions today.
Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit about, in line with that, it reminds me of, the little I know of meditation, the idea that you don't have to be your emotions. You can kind of accept the feelings that you're having and kind of, I envision it as being sort of above them, watching them pass by. And so, you can feel bored and acknowledge that, but you don't have to become bored in a sense. Like, it doesn't have to control you. You can kind of be a step removed. I'm wondering if, in writing this and working on this, and of course probably other earlier work as well, do you feel perhaps less, going with the title of your book, bored, lonely, angry, stupid, do you feel like these feelings are less visceral for you now because you're sort of more aware of the context than I'm sure most people are?
Perhaps not. I think as we're now a year out from having written the book. But certainly in the midst of writing it, for me, these categories began to sort of blend. You'd be thinking about boredom and going, well, am I really talking about boredom, or am I talking about loneliness? And so these categories that sort of on a visceral level we think of as separate become more and more blended, and you start to see the intersections between them. And to your question too, when I was growing up, my parents were academics. As intellectuals of sorts, I remember my sister during adolescence accusing my dad of making an intellectual playground out of emotions. And at the time, I didn't really understand what she meant. But in retrospect, I do, and that we've probably done the same thing, that in sort of looking at emotions with so much, dwelling on them so much, we intellectualize them. And the process of intellectualizing them, it's not that we don't feel them less, but in some level, maybe we become more, we experience them differently.
And I think it definitely helped us, I'm still struggling to spend less time online, which is particularly challenging during the age of the coronavirus. But, being able to say, oh, okay, I'm going online because, I'm seeking affirmation right now, or I'm seeking connection right now. And it's definitely made me more thoughtful about why I'm doing that. I think one hopeful place we came to as we were putting the chapters together and thinking about what they meant as a whole was that we realized, as individuals and even more as a culture, our emotions are changeable and they're not fixed. And it works if the whole society agrees that we're not going to just, focus on our selfies all the time. I'm not sure when that moment will happen, but, because emotions can change over time, that gives us some agency, that gives us some liberty to think about other ways to feel. And likewise, because our technologies are changeable, we can think about better ways to design them and better ways to deploy them. Writing this book was, an interesting investigation for us in both of our fields, but it was always also a very personal one, trying to understand what we were feeling and what in our society was helping produce those feelings. And I think it did give us some distance on our feelings. We haven't conquered it, internet addiction, sadly, yet, but we're working on it.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned earlier that there were these kind of provocative articles or essays or even books sometimes, asking, is Google making us stupid? Is Facebook making us lonely? And I think even if you ask someone like Nicholas Carr about that title, I think he would dismiss it sort of as, a provocative title that was meant to get readers and draw attention, but no philosopher or academic would make the argument, I think, that, there's a one-to-one correlation, a cause and effect. I think it's just a sort of attractive title to hone in on some of the interesting topics that are going on right now or that people are thinking about. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you would rephrase those kinds of questions, which you do in the book. So rather than contemporary people, audiences, scholars, students, what have you, rather than asking, is Google making us stupid or is Facebook making us lonely? How do you encourage people to think about these technologies?
Yeah. I mean, in our introductory chapter, we talk a bit about technological determinism and to what extent it informs our sort of historiography. I'm always maybe more attracted to that particular framing of history than other people are. So I admit to maybe having a liability there. And we don't want to just sort of think of it as that technology is rewiring our brains. It is more complicated than that. But certainly I think in that section, we do talk about the way that culture and sociology and our society do reshape who we are. And to the extent that technology is a part of culture and society, it does have an impact on the way we look at the world and the way that we experience it.
And, I think one thing that was helpful for us was to realize, let's just take narcissism as an example. The questions were, are selfies making us narcissistic? Is social media making us narcissistic? And what we discovered when we looked back to the 19th century was that there were these important precursors, and we identify three. There may have been more, but the rise of letter writing, the rise of photography, and the rise of mirrors as new technologies in the 19th century that began to teach Americans then new habits of self-presentation. And we wouldn't be, writing Instagram stories or Facebook posts had our ancestors not learned these new modes of self-presentation. And all of those technologies kind of democratized the ability to present yourself and instructed people on how to do so, how much to reveal, how much not to reveal. So in some ways that takes the focus off of just the 21st century technologies and says, there's a larger story here. It's not inevitable that photography would lead you to an obsession with the self or that letter writing would, but that they certainly contribute to the story. And we can't just all pin it on Silicon Valley.
Yeah, and I mean, back to a more philosophical level, we don't want to fall sort of prey or fall into the fallacy of technological determinism or sort of a simplistic narrative that it's just all about technology rewiring us. At the same time, we don't want to be, fall prey to the other sort of reductionism, sort of instrumentalism, where you say that, well, we've always felt these ways and then just new sort of technologies come along which allow us to channel those emotions that we've always had, through new technologies. It's that middle ground that you're always trying to negotiate or find, that threading that needle is difficult. There's liabilities both in embracing instrumentalism too strongly and determinism too strongly. We don't really, philosophize a lot about it, except right there in the beginning. It's always informing the narrative, at least in the background.
There are a lot of really interesting examples that I think people well, like myself, who are not particularly familiar with the history, can find just really amazing when you think about, for example, selfies, how it seems like smartphones created selfies, and to a certain extent, maybe they did. But then you talk about sort of Victorians posing for portraits and later for photography and it getting cheaper. And people, I found it really funny that, people who were, I forget the quote exactly, but you found something about people who were meek and not particularly powerful would make these very stern faces for their portraits, and then they would give that to people. But also how Frederick Douglass, for example, wanted to take his picture so that people would see a representation of a sort of strong, intelligent, civilized or cultivated, or however you want to phrase that with quotations there, black person, as opposed to the stereotypes that were very popular in the presses and popular among Americans at the time. So I'm curious if you could say a little bit about how you go back looking at that stuff, locating it, because I mean, it's not an easily ready-made history, right? Like you did some digging and found some really interesting examples as you went. But how did you go from, say, thinking about selfies to looking back and finding these examples? Do you have any sort of advice as you started to trace that? And also, I guess just to add a little bit more to it, do you have advice for not looking back and saying, well, Frederick Douglass was the first selfie guy, and, trying to place it, as you said earlier, in our current context? Because, of course, they were thinking in different ways, although we can see similarities now that we look back. So very big question, but maybe you could simplify it a little bit.
Well, we were lucky. I mean, there were a lot of good works on the history of photography that had been written, some of them in the early 20th century. Right as we were writing that book, a book came out on Frederick Douglass as the most photographed American of the 19th century. That wasn't our discovery. That was some art historians, but it did make us very aware that there were multiple purposes that you could put photography to. And we were also aware, as I'm sure many of your listeners are, of the long tradition of mortuary photography in the 19th century, taking pictures of dead people. And so, we became aware, like, the discourse today is focused on vanity or narcissism and our self-images. Let's go back to the origins of photography and see the popular response. And so we had some clues that there were a variety of responses, and we didn't want to say photography inevitably, inexorably led you to vanity. It did lead people to self-present and be really self-conscious about themselves, but it could also be, as Frederick Douglass used it, a political tool. It could be also a tool for maintaining family ties across distance and across generations. And so looking through diaries, letters, newspapers, photography ads were great ways to kind of understand what cultural codes people were using to talk about it then.
Yeah, and I mean, to your question too, it also depends. I mean, I think in the book, we try to negotiate this carefully, but it also depends what kind of who your audience is. I've always been inspired by the Tom Standage's book, an editor at The Economist, The Victorian Internet. And I think what partly explains the popularity of his text is it's very presentist in its sort of in its approach to history. It's like, well, we talk so much about the internet and the sort of impact on America and Britain. Let's look back at the precursors and show how the Victorians were just like us if we just can find the same examples. And of course, those times were different. But for a broad popular audience, it's sometimes sufficient and really consumable history to just show people the parallels, the way that the past and the present align.
Yeah, they're not identical, but there are resonances, and then there are distinctions too, right?
Yeah, what was anything, I guess, that might have surprised you when looking back? Your chapters are quite dense in terms of the amount of examples and the period that you look at, which is, in some cases, hundreds of years. And there were things that surprised me, but I'm curious if there were things in your research that surprised you as you started to look back and make connections.
Well, as the more Luddite half of this partnership, I was delighted to find people chopping down telegraph poles and telephone because I think we often imagine that our ancestors or earlier generations were all eager early adopters of new technologies. And as a person who finds myself trying to, stop the deluge, the examples of these 19th century pioneers having no use for the telegraph, even though they're out there on the Great Plains all by themselves and they chop down the poles, or sort of middle-class women in Vermont chopping down telephone poles that were just bothering them because they were noisy and ugly and didn't seem to have any practical value. That was both surprising and, to me, endearing.
Well, it illustrates the danger of presentism, because right now we're actually trying to work on an article, showing how the past resonates with the present. And one thing that immediately stood out is the COVID-19 conspiracy theorists who think that 5G cell phone towers are spreading the virus, and they're going around vandalizing them and trying to burn them down. And that, of course, immediately reminded me of the poles, earlier Americans chopping down the telephone poles. And we have read accounts of people thinking that telegraph was also transmitting cholera. So I came to the conclusion that they were chopping down the poles because of cholera, but we haven't actually found anecdotes, although we're looking. Earlier, we wrote an article a couple of years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. We wrote an article for the Chronicle. This was around when MOOCs were becoming really, quite the concern on universities, that we were all going to be, doing MOOC education, just I suppose as we now think we're going to end up doing Zoom education. I suppose it's not surprising delving into this stuff a lot, but a popular audience is usually surprised to learn that when radio came along, in the early 20th century, there were a lot of academics talking about what was the term they used back then, Susan?
Well, like universities of the air, or colleges of the air. Would have no need for universities anymore. They would just be in the ether.
Yeah, that this was the new disruptive technology that would threaten to sort of transform higher education. And I think that was certainly enlightening to many. At the time, I was more in correspondence with chief information officers at universities, and I think they were many of them were surprised to learn that these were not new conversations, that academics or institutions of higher education have been making similar prognostications about where the university was going with earlier technologies.
One other surprise that at first seemed sort of weird and outlandish to us, and now, because we know it so well, we take it for granted, but 19th century Americans, particularly when the telegraph came along, really wondered if they were overstepping divine boundaries by hooking into the energies of the universe. There seemed to be universal accord that electricity was a divine power. And there was a question where some ministers claimed we were kind of crossing a threshold. Not we, but 19th century Americans were crossing a threshold by trying to harness what was really essentially God's power. On the other hand, the more widespread response was, yes, this is God's power, but if he sort of allowed us to invent a telegraph, he must want us to have it. And so
what did Morse say when the first telegraph?
Yeah, what hath God wrought, right? This whole divine connection between technologies, which we think of as generally rather secular instruments, to 18th, 19th century Americans were controversial. They were spiritual. They might be transgressive. And so that was really interesting to us.
Yeah, I think it also demonstrates, like you said, the sort of circular history that can happen where we think that this is new because Twitter is proposing it, or that the threat seems to be Facebook. But a lot of these things have antecedents and really, really close ties to things that may even be hundreds of years old. But yeah, I think there's a lot to take in, and I think it's a lot to sort of think about in terms of context. Do you have advice, I guess, for, let's say, the new technologies? I mean, as you said, a lot of people are now using Zoom to teach and to correspond with people. I think it's probably tempting to think that all of these things that you've seen we're going to repeat, or that we may repeat. So do you have advice for people who are now maybe worried or happy with technologies that are coming or that are on the brink? Like I'm not sure what exactly might be the newest example, but going from the telegraph to Twitter, whatever comes after Twitter, how do you recommend approaching it or thinking about it?
Again, it's a word I learned from Tom Standage, not to be chronocentric, And I think historians often use not to suffer from historical amnesia, that at least obviously that the past is not just like the present, but understanding, being aware of the precursors to these new technologies is a helpful tonic. It doesn't mean that things can't be disruptive and aren't going to change the world in really profound ways, but we should at least be aware of these historical antecedents so that we can think of them in this larger context.
And I think another kind of message that we ended up with in the book was, we were trying to look at the long-term cumulative effects of 2 centuries of technological and emotional change. And what we came to see was that this new emotional style was developing, that many Americans were developing a new sense of an unlimited self, that you could have endless contacts across the world, unceasing entertainment, that there's a widespread belief that your brain could take in all the stuff that was coming your way. We worried, and we continue to worry, that maybe people are forgetting that there are limits on experience, on lifespan, on what we can do with our brains. And so I think a humility and awareness of limits is a good thing to carry with one as one contemplates new technologies. I think sometimes we've come to think of ourselves as merged with our devices and that their powers are our own. That's a point Nicholas Carr kind of makes in The Shallows, too, that we think Google's memory is our memory, but it's not. And we're still human, and we're frail, and we're mortal. We shouldn't mistake whatever technologies we have. We shouldn't mistake their powers for our own, because we still have human limitations.
Yeah, and maybe that's especially relevant given, the current crisis, where we probably are in some ways much more aware of our mortality and our limits, given the events that have transpired in the last month and a half as we've sort of sequestered ourselves in our homes. The message that we dwell so much on human limits and how our sense of them has changed across time is especially relevant given our present circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was fascinating to think that centuries ago, people were worried that you might have too many friends or too much excitement, especially compared to today, where everybody worries that they don't have enough friends or followers or what have you, and they don't have enough streams coming in. Really does put things into perspective. As we start to wrap up our conversation, I'm pretty sure you guys are the first couple that I've interviewed who have produced a book together. Do you have any advice, not necessarily for couples, although that would be interesting? Yeah, I'm curious how you work together. You're both in similar but different fields, and you've, I'm sure, contributed different parts to the book. So maybe you could say a little bit about how you worked together, and then maybe any lessons you might have learned from doing so.
I mean, one thing, I don't know if we're the exception to the rule, but when we tell other couples that we wrote a book together, they often seem surprised, like, how could you have done that? How did you still stay married? I don't think it really presented, certainly we have our differences, but they never seem to really affect our marriage, or at least not in an adverse fashion.
It certainly gave us a lot to talk about over the many years we wrote it. And one thing was we met in grad school in a political philosophy seminar, and that was really useful for having a shared framework to think about American individualism and American communitarianism and the tensions between those two. And so it was very good to have kind of a similar theoretical framework that we were working from. In the end, we wordsmithed every sentence together. So one of us might write one section and another section, but then we traded endless drafts, and it ended up being that, it truly was a joint work throughout every section of the book, which I think was good because we really had to hammer out tensions in our, as I said, I'm the Luddite and Luke works in a school of computing. So we had to figure out, well, what claims can we make that satisfy both of the theoretical commitments we have and is faithful to the evidence we're finding.
Yeah. So another on a more practical level, Susan, who's much more sort of enamored of archives than I am, would generally do the history up until World War II, and I would do post-World War II history. And another practical level, too, I think there was often a competition about getting drafts out. It's like, you get a draft out and go, well, now it's in your court, baby. Which was, was always a relief to get a draft out and be able to take a recess and watch the other person struggle with it.
But I will say that, while I like archives better than Luke, it still ended up being, I don't know, we'd find different parts of these narratives that intrigued us and focus on those sort of regardless of the time period. So I'm thinking Luke wrote a lot about the Lowell Mill girls, actually, because he found them engaging. And
all the contemporary history was we did all the interviews together. I mean, we did 55 interviews. I think only maybe 3 or 4 of them did.
One of us do, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. Do you have any strategies, I suppose? Well, first of all, are you going to work on the next project together? Or are you already working on something? What is the next step you're working on?
I think we're definitely seeing a lot of parallels right now in the age of coronavirus, where our technology use is so much on so many people's minds, and its limitations as well as its potential. So we're thinking about a host of articles that relate past to present. And we're also, one emotion we haven't talked about today, and we haven't really talked about as much in interviews or other writing we've done, is anger, which is the final chapter of the book. And I do think as an election year rolls around that we have some things to say about anger.
Yeah, I think I might. The longer game. I think I'm not at least sort of long range. I wouldn't call myself a historian of emotions. That's what Susan does. Of course, we wrote that last book together, and I think I'm taking a respite and going back towards more technical concerns, at least for a while, focusing on my teaching. But I don't think that means that we won't necessarily write another book together.
Yeah,
sometime in the future.
And something that's intrigued us as well is just emotion AI, which has become such a focus in Silicon Valley with, supposedly Alexa's going to be able to know what we feel, and so are our cars. And so we've written some articles on that. And I think while Luke may not be interested in pursuing historical research as much going forward, a lot of this will apply to current technology studies and user experience.
Yeah, no, we've already been doing that. I mean, we really have focused this last year, and not just sort of putting the book out there and just sort of waiting to see what would happen, but we've devoted a fair amount of time to sort of writing articles and going on podcasts like yours to do some publicity about it. And yeah, and I think Susan just mentioned one. We had a blog post a couple months ago, and the Los Angeles was review of books on the AI doesn't know how you feel, where we try to make some connections between the history of the emotions and current AI research as relevant as possible to contemporary concerns.
Yeah, what have you found people responding to most, especially when it comes to bored, lonely, angry, stupid? Are there ideas or chapters that you think have been resonant more than others or captured readers' attention more?
It's interesting. We were just thinking about that prior to this conversation. What audiences have really been interested in our work, and certainly there's a technical audience in Silicon Valley who somewhat interested in, oh, wow, there's a history behind all of this, but also a religious audience, too, that has found some resonance. We're not writing from a particular faith, but we're writing oftentimes about people, moralists who are from a religious faith, and I think it has a deep relevance for many of them.
Yeah, and so it's been kind of across the spectrum of religious responses, from people who seem like conservative Christians to very liberal religious groups who have been interested in how earlier generations thought about solitude and awe. That's right, and tried to kind of reduce the number of distractions they had that were keeping them from focusing on the grandeur of the universe or the divinity of the creator. These were all the 19th century concerns, and those have resonated. There have been some interest from Entrepreneur magazine named it one of the best books of the year because the editor said it showed that earlier generations had lived through technological change and gotten through it, and that maybe some of our pessimism was unwarranted. So it's been an interesting range of responses.
Yeah, with our students too. I mean, just this semester I was teaching engineers. Engineering Culture is the title of the course. And here in Utah, many of our students are people of faith. I mean, they're from, the old term was Mormon. We call them now
the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is now the preferred state of the art.
And I think a lot of them, are very much interested in, exploring their relation to God and how that informs their own what it means to be human. They were definitely interested in finding out that as much as we want to sort of explore our relationship to God in a way of illuminating what it means to be human, it's also helpful to explore our relationship with technology, and that can also illuminate again what it means to be human, and that both of these questions resonate with one another.
Yeah, I mean, it gives so much to think about in many of the ways that you've addressed today, and many more that readers who haven't picked up the book can find for themselves. And well, Luke and Susan, I really appreciate you talking to me about the book. It's been fun hearing more about it, and I definitely encourage others to pick it up if they haven't yet.
Thank you. It's been great talking with you.
Yes, thank you.
As always, thank you so much for listening to and supporting This Is Not a Pipe podcast. Make sure you check out tinapp.org and see what Luke and Susan have suggested as book recommendations. Check out what other authors have suggested, see what's coming up in the future. And it's always very much appreciated when you can repost or retweet or send a positive review this way. There's also a buy me a coffee option where you can support the podcast in other ways. I hope everyone, particularly considering the times that we're living in, which I feel like I seem to say every week, but it's always something, and it's always dire in the last few years. I hope everyone is doing as well as they possibly can be. My heart goes out to everyone who is dealing with extreme situations that I wish were not the case, but I hope everyone can get through this. I hope we can all move forward, and I hope during the summer, whether you're studying or teaching or what have you, that you can have some respite and read a book, enjoy yourself, and hopefully, make the best of what has not been a great 4 years in many ways in America, but we'll get better. Until next time, I have a few podcasts left, to be precise, for June, and then we'll take a brief hiatus and be back in the fall. I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.